body on it. I mean, like without a stamp. Maybe it would be the body.
Well, it's right.
Ten years ago, 12 years ago, meanwhile, fly out to Block Island. Yeah.
Hey everybody, gonna try and get this show on the road here. You're having a good time at this Rendezvous. What's number 39? I think I've been at 38 of them. Kind of amazing. And Lance, you've been at 39 of them, right? Yeah. What I'm going to try to talk about, I don't have a whole lot planned, but we're going to just talk about what it takes to restore a car and maybe some of the interesting or difficult aspects of restoring a car, especially a car like this. This is registered as a 64 Citroën DS19 Chapron, owned by Lance Hellman and Michaela Hellman. And Lance owned it how many years?
38.
38 years. And it came out of storage 3 years ago. And so at that time, they brought it to our shop, and we, well, you follow these pictures over the time of the car that as it was restored. They ended up bringing it in the middle of winter, or the beginning of winter in a snowstorm, and that was an adventure. Everything that Lance has done with this car has been a super big adventure, including the restoration. So they got the car to us, and then we ended up over the first year of the project disassembling it and starting to work on the rust repairs. And the car was it looked really nice on the outside, but underneath it was very, very rusty. And 3 years ago, I think it was 2012, we had it here in this exact same spot, all cut apart on the rotisserie, with just the rust hanging there. So it was it showed how far down the car went before it got to this point. It was, you know, every bit of rubber, undercoat, anything, wiring, every single piece on the car was gone. It was all just bare metal, what metal was there. And over the next year, my helper Rob did a whole lot of metal repairs, and we were able to get a whole lot of parts, replacement parts, but we also had to make a lot of parts of the frame. There's a lot of different methods that people have used over the years to restore these cars, and one of the methods is to get a different car and use the whole car as a donor and just put the body on it. We went round and round and back and forth about whether we should do that or not, and finally we decided to try to keep this car as original as possible and use as much of the original metal as possible. So this car was really dissected, and pieces were pieced in everywhere, the whole length of the car, front to back. And that may have been more time consuming, but we believe it's a more original car because more of the original frame is there. So that was challenging, but fun to do. It did take a lot of time on the rotisserie. It's difficult when you do that. You need to make sure everything lines up well and everything still fits. Test fitting parts of the car on and off the car multiple times to try to make sure everything worked. Convertibles are notoriously weak, even when they're brand new. The chassis flex, and even this car's flexes a little bit. And the early cars flex a lot more than the later cars. So, you know, trying to fix a car and then align all the body panels, and then you do that on the rotisserie, and then you put it on the floor, and then it moves a little bit, and you have to realign everything. It's a very challenging process to go through. But we got pretty good. The car runs pretty well. Every single part of the car has been touched. I think one of the only things that we didn't have to do much to was the wiring harness. We just replaced rubber ends on it and cleaned it. The wiring from that vintage seems to hold up pretty well. But the engine was completely rebuilt. The old 3 main bearing engines have a crankshaft with plugs in that screw in, and they don't have oil filters. So, you know, those engines generally will go bad about every 100,000 miles or less, 80 to 100,000 miles, because the crankshafts fill up with the grit that centrifuges out of the oil as the engine's running, because it doesn't have an oil filter. So we cleaned all that stuff, and this engine should last a lot more miles than Lance and Michaela will probably ever drive it, hopefully. And went through the transmission. Pretty straightforward. The hydraulic system, these early cars had LHS or brake fluid if they came to the U.S. and we converted it to LHM, the grain fluid that is in all the later cars. That was also a big topic of discussion as to what would be the most correct, or keep the car the most valuable, or which way to go. Brake fluid was had problems in corrosion and making the hydraulic units fail. And if you had a leak, the paint, brake fluid leak, it gets on the paint, can pull the paint off. It's a really good paint remover. So in the long run, we decided to go to LHM because it's a very you can get seals for it, and the cars are very reliable, and they still use it. They used it for many, many more years than they did brake fluid. But doing that, some of the old hydraulic components on the car didn't necessarily make correct seals, so we had to make stuff work on that. A lot of extra hydraulics with Citroën, and so that's always a challenge to do. I think we got that worked out real well. We had a lot of discussions about whether we should paint the hydraulic units black or green, and all these cars came with black hydraulic units from if they were brake fluid cars to begin with. And we decided to keep that way, and then just put the sign that's on the hydraulic tank so you don't get the wrong fluid, because that would not work real well if you did. But we tried, in making all these types of decisions, to look at the future and keep in mind what would help improve the value of the car, and try to keep that all in mind, along with what would be best for running of the car. This car looks really nice, but it's going to be driven, and to drive a car, it's got to run good. You can't break it down everywhere. So you have to keep that in mind when you're restoring it. Oh, okay. So after the chassis was finally all welded together, we sent it to Ensing Auto Body in Latham, New York, and they painted the chassis. That's what these pictures are here. The car was still on the rotisserie. The body was not on it. It was painted inside and out, upside down, every which way. They had 2 guys on it spraying paint for about 8 hours to get the whole car done. And multiple coats of epoxy primer and a urethane paint. So the chassis should be really well sealed for forever. And obviously it's never going to be driven in the winter or anything like that, probably never in the rain. after you get your chassis done, then we could start building the car back up. When you do that, you know, you have to, cars are built in layers. So you've got to figure out what goes into the car first, and that's always challenging because Citroëns have a lot of layers. So we got worked through that, putting the suspension on and rebuilding everything along the way, all the brakes. We rebuilt or made a whole bunch of new hydraulic lines. And eventually got to a point where we had a chassis that could roll around. The one picture over there, we had with number 11 there's replumbing the car was time consuming, and that was also a challenge in what should we do with the hydraulic lines. The original lines had like a copper color coating on them, and new lines that you get don't necessarily look that way. And what we ended up doing was a lot of the lines were in good shape. We cleaned them and then sealed them or painted them like with a satiny clear, so hopefully they won't rust in the future or anything. And then we found this Chapron type of brake line, which looks coppery colored and very easy to work with, and made hydraulic lines that we couldn't reuse out of that. So you know, it's pretty time consuming to go through all the lines on the whole car, make them look the way they did, and attach them all. The hydraulic lines, they can't vibrate or move around because of the brake. So you have to be very careful. My Upper Carter is really, really into the parts books, and he's a detail guy. So, you know, if we needed to know, if we didn't have a picture, we took thousands of pictures of the car as it came apart. But if we didn't know how a part was supposed to be from our pictures, you could go into the parts book and try to figure out what the part was and where it was attached and how it was attached. And you know, hopefully we came up with that. Got all that stuff in the right position. It's really important to get all that, the hydraulic lines in the right position. If they rub against each other, you'll have a failure. Get stuck out in the road. You get enough people looking at you, just drive this thing. You don't want to looking at it because you have fluid everywhere. We also, in doing a project like this, we have to act like a general contractor that's building a house, and you have a bunch of different things being done all at the same time. While we were working on parts that we could do, we had things out at the machine shop being machined. We had parts out being replated or re-chromed. There's a lot of parts on the car that got powder coated, mainly because it was cheaper and it lasted a really long time. It looks just like paint. So that works really well. So we had that stuff being done. Pete Bandy from Michigan had the leather and redid all the leather seats and door panels. We have a local guy, John Nisselbeck's working on the top. Actually, you've not seen the top up yet. That's because the top's not done. So, and that's why we have a big tent. But fortunately, we've had a couple of really nice days of weather, and Lance and Michaela have been able to drive it. And it's been running quite well. Trying to coordinate all these parts and pieces from the machine shop and the upholstery shop and the top shop and the paint shop and everybody, all to get them to come in and mesh all at the same time is very, very difficult on a job like this, especially if you have a deadline, and this was sort of our deadline. I mean, we could have picked any day, but we really wanted to try to get it here for Father's Day for him. And we do have the car so that he's driving home now, and we're able to drive it. There's lots of cool pictures here. What else should I say? Answer any questions.
Yeah, that's what we want. We want to hear it run.
We can start it up in a minute.
Okay.
You know, one other thing about assembling a car like this, especially when it's from, you get multiple people working on it in different areas, putting it all together, it's really, really challenging to get all the pieces to fit together. Like, yeah, it may have been difficult at times. Just trying to get the window winder handles to fit with new more cards, thicker leather, who knows, maybe even the paint sticker. It takes forever to get the window winder handle. Everything is a challenge. There's many parts on the car that are really unique to the Chapron convertibles. They're very, very expensive, very, very rare, really, really hard to get. It turns out, like, these pieces here, this long one on each side of the car, they were crushed completely, and we didn't think they could be fixed. So there's an old guy, I guess he's like 80 years old in Germany, that makes them. So it took them like 6 months to make them, because he's 80, he wants to retire. I think there's people around that can do it, but those are like the only 2 pieces of reproduction trim that are on the car. All the rest of the trim had dents in it or scratches or holes in it. We've got a TIG welder. Some of the stainless steel, there were holes from screws that we put through them. I pounded them out, welded them up with the TIG, with stainless steel filler liners, and we ground them and polished them. They're all back on the car. You know, you can see little imperfections in them, but they could be taken to the next level. But we're not trying to win Pebble Beach with this car. We're trying to have a really, really nice car. It's a really, really nice car. But that's just some of the effort that goes into some pieces like that. We think this car was in at least 1 crash in its life, maybe 2, and it didn't have the correct rear bumper on it. The original D model bumper is about this long. We were able to find a real Chapron lower bumper half from Doug Benfield in Colorado, and the deck lid that was on the car had like 2-inch waves that the fiberglass had, and it wasn't really fixable. And Doug also had a deck lid, so we tried to make that fit, and we got good. But trying to, the other option was in Europe they're making carbon fiber replacement deck lids for 35 years plus. So, this is an original Chapron deck lid, so we stuck with that and got that to work. Any questions?
How did you weld the rear clip on if the frame had already been painted?
That was painted all the way. It was painted all the way around, and then they just ground where they were going to spot weld or
just touch it up.
Yeah, that's right. And then after the body was welded back on, then we went back up in all the cracks and crevices and repainted up in there as we could. The other thing that we did, the whole car will eventually be fluid film to keep it from rusting, but for now we've just sprayed fluid film in the quarter panels in the doors, because they're pretty much sealed up for good now, in the front fenders. But we're going to do the frame later. There's a little more to go on the car, but it's I don't know, it's probably 95-98%
Dave, how many were made? How many are still around this?
I believe there was 1,100 or 1,300, and they were made over a 15-year period. And there's not many left. I don't know if there's half of that. That might be a lot. And each one kind of started out as a 4-door, sort of.
Wow.
Dave, you said this is a DS19?
Yeah.
Obviously, then there's a difference between this and the ID19, which I didn't know there was a DS19. I thought it was an ID19 or DS21 and up.
Can you elaborate on that, Carter?
The first D-Series car was a DS19 from 1956. In late 1957, the ID19 was released as a less expensive and less complicated model of DS. It didn't have the automatic clutch and hydraulic shifting system, had a simplified braking system, and much less luxurious appointments. The first Chapron convertible was 1961, and it was based, the factory convertible, it was based on a DS19. The ID19 was offered as a cabriolet also. Very few were built because you wouldn't necessarily want to start off with an inexpensive car that didn't have luxurious appointments and make it into a cabriolet. But they do exist. The DS21 came on the market in 1967, 1966, and it's similar to a DS19 but with a bigger engine and some other technical modifications.
Thank you.
But this is the Limousine,
This is a DS19 Limousine Cabriolet.
and the difference between, is that a toned down cabriolet? Or is
No,
it
it means that it was approved by the factory and given a factory serial number. Chapron made coach-built cars in other versions also,
Right.
but they were not necessarily, they weren't called Citroëns exactly. This was from the old days of coach builders and the way they would buy a chassis and modify it to the customer specifications. But these were a sort of a cast-in-stone design that Citroën approved, and they were sold through Citroën dealers.
Okay.
Which parts were powder coated?
There's a lot of stuff under the hood. Most of the set parts were powder coated. The wheels were painted. We don't. A lot of the time, if you powder coat a wheel, the powder coat won't go into where the center part of the wheel is attached to the outer part, and you can get rust bleeding from that. So these were painted, and they can get. It rolls down into the crack.
Is the sheet metal that's not part of the sedan, the Chapron came having that out?
Yes. They didn't. I don't know if they stamped. You know if they stamped the bottom.
It was formed. Madame Chapron told me that it was formed over wooden forms by hand for each car.
And it's interesting that Andre Pohl's guest here is
Noelle Chapron.
she's here today, the daughter of
Dave, on the windshield on this car, is it taller than a normal D? Standard DS windshield? Okay. And all cabriolets are like that?
All Limousine Cabriolet.
Okay.
There were some special Chaprons that had a lower windshield. So, cars like the Le Paris.
Yeah.
That's a different windshield.
The regular sedan has removable quarter panels. This here, I see from those photos that it's all one piece. You have the whole wheel clip. It's all one piece.
That's right. Chapron, when they made it, there was a weld seam, which if you look, I don't know if it's in any of these photos, but when we had it soda blasted, you could see a hand weld going down right about here and one here.
So it was basically a removable thing that was welded together, more or less.
And the doors are longer than a regular D door. And right about here, there's a seam that they took two doors and made one long.
Okay, that was my next question, whether that was longer because it's a two-door.
And you might even be able to see on the inside a little bit some of the weld, but they were really, really good welders. So I think they did most of it with a torch. And, they didn't warp it. It's just really hard.
The weld was just butted, they were not overlapped.
No, just butted together. You're a real artist.
Real fast.
Yeah.
Because the overheating the metal. It's not working. That's good.
Anything else?
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. Congratulations to them. They, you know, if the Hellmans didn't have the foresight, well, if Lance didn't have the foresight to buy this car 40 years ago and save it all that time, you know, it wouldn't be around. I passed one of these up for $600 in 1980. He had the smarts to do it. I didn't.
I had owned 20 or 30 Citroën, but I never owned a convertible. So I've been looking around the Northeast for them, and I found them in better shape that I couldn't afford, or horribly rusty that I thought weren't worth saving. So this one was bought under duress. The last thing I needed was another car, but I really wanted a convertible. And I found this little note card that where I listed where all the money came from to buy it. And I've worked part-time on Citroëns and some other cars. And I wrote $50 from so-and-so, $200 from my cash advance or my Visa card. So it cost, 38 years ago, it cost me a total of around $800. And I wrote at the bottom of this note card, don't spend more money on this car.
It worked for 38 years, right?
Yeah. So Michaela 3 years ago said, Dad, you've got to get this restored. You know, 'cause it's been in the back of my barn for about 20 years. And she offered to begin to pay for the restoration. So that launched it. That launched the process. So I've taken over paying, but Peter Bandy, where I saw him here a second ago. Peter, he did the leather interior, as David said, local shop, Ensign, the bodywork, David's shop, massive amount of stuff. I had a friend here very briefly today who was with Michaela and myself when we picked the car up after my divorce was final. and we had a very terrible trip driving back from Bristol, Vermont to Boston, where I lived at that time, because I very stupidly drove it with the gas that had been in the gas tank for 5 or 10 years. So clogged up the fuel pump, clogged up the carburetor, and we were in a rainstorm in the middle of the night, and then the starter quit working. And it was quite an ordeal. So I have pictures of Michaela when she was 8, when we picked up the car. So it's been in the family. I can't say I've enjoyed owning it. I like knowing we had it, but I never really got. Every time I drove it from one parking spot to the other over the years was very stressful. So it's a kind of amazing thing to see it complete after so long. And I appreciate the various people whose input ended up reassembling this. Because if you remember, as David said, it was just a chassis here 2 years ago? 3 years ago? Just the bare chassis on the rotisserie here. It didn't look much like a car.
Is this original color?
Yeah, Rouge Ruby. We tried very hard to get the original color, so we think this is it. The shop last fall, Michaela and I went with Dave to the shop. I hoped that the body shop, if they met the father and daughter and worked with Dave, they'd be extra careful and get it done on time. That didn't happen. The extra careful happened, but they looked at a painted piece under the steering wheel that they felt had never been exposed to light, and they tried very hard to duplicate that. And they spray painted a kind of funny car model, and David sent that to me, and we took that to the shop. You know, I do some artwork, so it looked as close as I thought was humanly possible, and they tried very hard. So, yeah, I think this is it. This is the color. We had intended to have 2 different front ends on it from my parts collection, the normal American front end fenders with their lights, but I had stripped a car that was assembled in Belgium with the European lighting system, so that's what we're using right now.
They happen to be the best fenders of all the ones that we had to work with, so we just picked those first to get, because it was easier. And even those, they look really good. There was hours and hours of cutting and welding out. Because once you strip them, all the corruption shows up.
Are those fenders identical to the sedan?
Yes.
the story is that originally Chapron wanted the factory to supply him the basic cars so he could create the convertibles. They weren't interested, so he had to buy complete cars and then convert them into a convertible. But when they saw them, then Citroën approved of that, and they supplied him maybe the station wagon chassis, which is a little stronger, and then he did his work on that. So if you look at some old books, you'll see him being supplied basically with the chassis and everything from here on. That was the same. But as Dave said, when we had these doors apart, you could see the weld where they used two doors and created this, the convertible door slightly longer. Yeah, in that ride back from Bristol, Vermont, practically 38 years ago, during that horrible rainstorm, Michaela fit in the back seat so she could sleep here. She doesn't fit anymore. Do you have any questions from me about it?
Do you know the original ownership and history of the car?
We're the second owners. Michaela and I are the second. The first owners owned the electric company in Osable, New York, and they bought it from New York City and they had it worked on in Montreal. Yeah. And all the years we've had it, I never realized the bumper was wrong. You know, they had a sedan bumper because they lost a bumper and they replaced it with a sedan bumper. So when it came to restoration and trying to do everything to make it original, as Dave said, we had to go and search to get an authentic Chapron bumper that would wrap around the back of the car here. Any other questions for me or for Dave?
Do you want to introduce
Yes.
Madame?
Noel.
Introduce her.
She didn't want to be
She want to be? Okay.
Can I call her?
All right. Never mind.
Chapron badge.
David?
Have a trim pieces or badges?
On the floor. I'm not putting my front license plates until they stop me.
There she is. She's there. She's there.
Very nice. That's great.
Like for you all, we're really lucky this weekend. This is Chapron here. Her father, Andre Chapron, he was responsible for building all these cars and really.